Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss Holy Trinity Sunday and the second and third Sundays after Pentecost, also known as Propers 6 and 7, or Lectionaries 11 and 12 of Ordinary Time. We have a few content notifications for this episode. For the second Sunday after Pentecost, in our conversation about the second reading, we talk about death and self-euthanasia or suicide. We also, in the gospel reading for the second Sunday after Pentecost, unpack Sodom and Gomorrah and kind of debunk some of that. And then for the gospel reading for the third Sunday after Pentecost, we talk about sexual assault, harassment, and accusations. If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Also, if you appreciate what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. Not only do you get access to special content, but you'll also be helping us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us, since not everybody has a quick quotes quill to meet their access needs.
Our first Sunday for this episode is Holy Trinity Sunday, which falls on June 7th this year. On Holy Trinity Sunday, we celebrate the relationship of the Trinity, Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier, and how the faces of God, not to be confused with the face of Bo, reach out to us in different ways and yet are still one. Of note, the relationship between and within the Trinity is not like Quirrell and Voldemort being sort of one when Voldemort is in the back of Quirrell's head. God might wear a turban if God wants to, but not for that reason.
Wah, wah.
Our first reading is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4a. God creates the cosmos and declares that everything that God has created is good. So one of the themes in this passage is balance. We read of God creating both light and dark, of God working and resting. And I was thinking about the ways that for the Harry Potter universe, all four houses are needed for balance, because otherwise it would get really quite out of hand quite quickly. But then I was thinking about the individual people, and I don't know that anybody really has a good balance, at least not any of the characters that have the larger roles. It seems like Flitwick's got a pretty good head on his shoulders, but we don't know that much about him to know if he actually has...
Does he have loyalty and... Well, I guess we know he has bravery because of the battle, but does he also have, cunning and ambition, in addition to being a Ravenclaw?
I was like, he is a Ravenclaw, so he has that one. But, does he have balance in his own life?
Yeah.
I don't know. The students don't seem to.
I mean,
Harry
Flitwick seems to have pretty good, natural balance when it comes to standing on tops of stacks of books.
That's true. Harry seems to have not very much balance. He just kind of races from Quidditch to fighting evil people.
I mean, yeah, he does not have a lot of time to, try to create balance.
Yeah, there's no rest in there.
He doesn't, yeah, no.
That's the one piece of Harry that I, really relate to, is when it's there's no time for anything. I'm involved in all the things, which feels so very real right now in my life. As we dive into the reading, in the first couple of verses, we hear the somewhat famous in church circles and in biblical circles, in the beginning, when God began. And the thing that popped into my head was, in the beginning, when Dumbledore began to orchestrate Voldemort's demise, Privet Drive was a quiet street and darkness covered it. Because, who doesn't want to retell the entire creation story via Harry Potter's creation story?
Come to think of it, orchestra conductor might be another job that probably suits Dumbledore better than being a headmaster when it comes to orchestrating things. In addition to being a defense attorney, like I think we mentioned last episode.
Yeah, Dumbledore could be a defense attorney. Dumbledore could be an orchestra conductor. Those would both work.
I mean, he even has the wand.
Exactly. He might get folks levitating, though. With a little bit of swish and flick. Gotta be make sure he's not
depending on what the piece is,
words.
that might be very appropriate. I don't know, just don't accidentally levitate them in front of the cannon if you're doing the 1812 overture. That would be a problem. Actually, knowing Dumbledore, he'd probably levitate the cannon, which would be a whole different set of problems.
I was going to say, there'd be so much to do there.
Yeah.
In verse 3, we hear that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And it just got me wondering if God had the deluminator from the last time that they put out the lights. Were they just carrying it in their pocket, a.k.a. the black holes?
God was practicing good environmentally friendly energy waste reduction or something by putting the lights out instead of just leaving them on all the time.
Exactly. That's what the deluminator's for. Didn't you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's how it works.
And as we get closer to the end of the passage, we run into, in verse 24, what might be a Harry Potter version of this verse. "Let the earth bring forth creatures of every kind, nifflers and flopperworms, chimeras and hippogriffs." I love reimagining parts of the Bible that are like this in the Harry Potter world, because the lists get so much more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Don't they? And then in verse 26, God says, "Let us make humankind in our image." And that made me wonder about, in the Harry Potter universe, is magic in the image of God or not? Like, is that why magic is fictional? Because it's not in the image of God? Because magic can change things that already exist, but it isn't really much for creating brand new stuff, which is definitely in the image of God. I think we see magic change stuff that already exists more. I kind of wonder about that, because it seems like the way that magic works and the way that God works seem to be two very different things.
Interesting. But magic and image are practically the same word. They have all of the same letters except for one, and that one letter is just off by a hyphen. So,
well, yes, but one letter in a 5-letter word
God.
is still 20%.
But it's only like a quarter of that letter.
That's still 5%. Do you know
Exactly.
how much our DNA has in common with, like, chimpanzees and also dolphins?
Minor detail. Do you know how much our physiology has with dolphins? Thank you.
Well, they are mammals.
More than 5%. Yeah, that's not 95% of them, though.
No. Our next reading is from 2 Corinthians, chapter 13, verses 11 through 13. At the end of his second letter to the church in Corinth, Paul invites them to live peacefully together and gives them a trinitarian blessing that may be familiar to us.
One of the themes in this passage is endings. This is the end of Paul's second letter, and it's the final letter that we have, so think about it as the ending of endings. Paul's ending is very much more benevolent and affirming than Dudley's ending in Deathly Hallows, where he says to Harry, "I don't think you're a waste of space."
So affirming.
So affirming.
Like, I mean, to be fair, given what Dudley's been raised with, that's not bad.
That's like vast improvements, which is,
that's pretty good, but yes.
Maybe the saddest part of this all. Yeah. And then, of course, Petunia comes in and is like sobbing and crying over Dudley.
Yeah. When we reach verse 11, which is pretty easy because it's, the first verse in this reading.
And there's a whole 3 of them.
Yeah, as you guys might imagine, we do actually wind up talking about the same verse yet again in this reading. Although, to be fair, we only do that once, which is pretty good for only having 3 verses to talk about.
Yeah.
But in verse 11, Paul instructs the Christians in Corinth to put things in order, among other things. And from what we've seen, I think that magical people would probably be pretty terrible at doing this. They mostly seem to be more chaotic and random than muggles on average. Especially note Hermione's comment about most wizards don't have an ounce of logic. And a lot of them seem to be more bless this mess kind of people instead of put things in order kind of people, with the possible exception of Madame Pinch.
Who is way too much put things in order and not enough bless this mess / whisper.
I think I've always liked her a little more than you have, because while I'm not thrilled with her insistence on quiet in the library, I have a lot of sympathy for librarians in school settings, especially, and I can't imagine being a magical librarian at Hogwarts. and how much general chaos she's trying to head off at the pass all the time.
I imagine she is as well, but I know enough librarians who are Harry Potter fans who really are not fans of how Madame Pince is a librarian.
I mean, we don't really see that much of it, but yeah.
Yeah. In verse 12, I read about the call from Paul to greet one another with a holy kiss. And while my immediate reaction was, PSA, do not do this during the pandemic.
Unless there's someone who you live with, in which case
and already shared
they're in
germs
your
with.
Quarantine bubble already, so, you know.
Yeah, but even then, it's like, you gotta already be sharing germs with them, because if you have different levels of risk household, it doesn't work. But then my second thought was, Madame Maxime is great at this. She already greets people with a kiss. God.
I'm glad that your initial thought was going to Madame Maxime, because I read this passage, which actually goes on a little further. Greet one another with a holy kiss, all the saints greet you. And my initial thought was, this is not like Aunt Marge with Dudley times several million. A holy kiss, one would hope, is A, 100% about consent, and B, much less condescendingly enthusiastic.
True.
God does not have the attitude toward people that Aunt Marge has toward Dudley, her little nephew poo, I hope. And we should not have that attitude toward one another.
Mm-hmm. Although elephants think about that for us. I think it's actually been debunked, but I just like elephants. The idea of elephants thinking about us like little puppies. I think it's adorable.
Yes. Or I've heard many theories of cats believe that people are just deeply, deeply incompetent kittens. You know, enormous kittens who also don't have any fur. But that's why they do things like bring us mice, because they've realized that we can't hunt for ourselves.
One more reason why I'm not a cat person.
Every cat is different.
Yeah. Yeah, you just had to take my elephant conversation and move it to a cat conversation. And
that's how I relate to things. Compare everything to cats.
I really like that I totally derailed the conversation by talking about elephants, and then I called you on derailing my derailment, and you didn't come back with, you're the one that started it.
I try not to have that reaction. It doesn't seem to, A, be useful, or B, go to good places.
That's my family reaction. You started it. Anyway, in verse 13, Paul's final blessing of leaving is the grace of the sovereign Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with all of you. And so then I was thinking about the blessings at when people are leaving, and the closest we get is kind of McGonagall sending Harry with a blessing on his search for the diadem at the beginning of the Battle of Hogwarts. But her blessing is really like, don't you have something you're supposed to be doing? Go! So it's not quite a blessing, but yeah. Our gospel reading for Holy Trinity Sunday is Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. Saying farewell to the disciples before ascending to heaven, Jesus gives them the great commission to go to all nations and baptize in the name of the Trinity. So one of the themes that's maybe obvious because we said it in the summary is commissioning. Jesus is commissioning their followers, and so it got me wondering about commissions within the magical world, and I don't know if, was there ever some sort of ceremony or ritual to commission the Order of the Phoenix?
Ooh.
Certainly there wasn't from the government, because they were, operating without government authority.
Although I imagine that there is one for, joining the ministry.
You think? But is there?
I mean, I'm sure they have paperwork.
For sure, paperwork.
You know that they have paperwork.
I mean, yes, they have paperwork, but that's not the same thing as, a ceremony or a ritual.
Yes.
Right?
There might be, an
even
oath
the
or
DA
something.
doesn't. Maybe. But even, Dumbledore's army doesn't have any. They, just sign the paper, and then Harry just kind of quiets everybody down and gets going.
This is an organization started by Harry, let's just get to the real stuff that matters, Potter. So, I don't really think he's big on ceremonies.
That's true. But even in, so I just finished watching the series Arrow on Netflix, and that one, they at least have a ritual around heading out or beginning a mission, which is, as simple as one person saying, suit up, and then everybody, presumably suits up in their, crime-fighting outfits, and then goes.
So you're saying that Harry needed a crime-fighting outfit?
But, that would be hilarious to try and think of crime-fighting outfits that also work with, like, robes in the magical world, because the rule is no capes.
That is presumably what he does with his life. It would be a very interesting series if Harry had, instead of becoming an Auror, become a vigilante. Like, then J.K.
Right.
Rowling could have just kept going for eons.
Mm-hmm. I mean, she's doing that anyway.
Well, yeah.
But, mm-hmm.
In verse 17, we hear that a bunch of people saw Jesus after the resurrection, but some doubted. And I wondered what the point is of including the phrase, but some doubted, because as you read the passage, it's kind of an awkward phrase. It's kind of like it's been inserted there, and there's no other reference to it. It's not addressed whatsoever. But the interesting thing, and I think possibly one of the reasons why this was included, is because it means that the doubters were included in the Great Commission. So being a Christian and having some doubts is okay. We're actually expected to have some people with doubts in our midst. It reminds me of while Harry answered questions and acknowledged that people had different ideas about what had happened in the past, when he was starting the DA, he did not give a test of right belief before allowing people to join.
You did have to, like, not believe that he was...
Yeah, I mean, you had
wrong.
to not be exactly counter to him, but, like, there were probably other conspiracy theories involved that he did not check to see whether or not people believed.
True.
And there was no test. It was just, look, if you think that Voldemort's back, and I'm in favor of fighting against Voldemort, then let's go. So.
True. I was thinking about it. I love this verse, and there are other verses, I think, in the Gospel of Matthew that have the, like, worship and doubt paired together.
Yes.
Certainly in the Gospels, but I think specifically Matthew. And I love that because trust and doubt do go together. When we talk about faith, I really appreciate Paul Tillich's faith without doubt is not faith, it's certainty, and certainty is not faith. And so doubt is not just acceptable, but is necessary for faith. So I love that pairing of them and that holding them together in tension.
Yes.
Kind of like when the adults all trust Dumbledore, and therefore trust Harry's mission after Dumbledore dies, but they also doubt.
Which is fair, because Harry's 17 and has some pretty, wacky plans.
I mean, he's not even 17 when Dumbledore dies, but yeah. So, like, there is this balancing of trust and doubt.
And let's be fair, some parts of the Christian story are kind of amazing, and so having a little doubt is actually pretty reasonable. We tell a lot of very weird stories that you don't notice how weird they are until you think about what they must sound like to someone who's never heard them before, when you grow up with them.
I don't know what you're talking about. 3 to 4 people dancing in a furnace.
In verse 18, we hear Jesus say, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And when I read this sentence, I said to myself, I can just hear Voldemort saying that and then having a gigantic evil wah-ha-ha-ha-ha afterwards, can't you? Giant evil cackle. And you know that Voldemort would use that authority, not granted to him, but authority that he claimed anyway, to subjugate and destroy anyone that he didn't like. Whereas Jesus sent the...
Literally what he tried to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Literally.
Literally and literarily.
Oh, goodness. Whereas Jesus sent the apostles out to people everywhere across the planet to welcome them into the church without barrier. He didn't say you can only go to people with blue eyes.
That's good, because there were, like, no blue-eyed people.
Pretty much. Or Jesus didn't say you can only go to right-handed people. Jesus didn't say you can only go to people who believe that the correct image for the Holy Spirit is a dove and not a, loon or whatever. There were no barriers put in that. Just go out to all nations and baptize.
I want a loon for the Holy Spirit.
That's one of my favorite examples of ways that Christians can disagree with each other and still work together, because it's something that I've honestly never run into a Christian who doesn't use a dove as the bird image of the Holy Spirit. But I love the mental image of, like, Christians who have a loon as the Holy Spirit, or Christians who have a toucan, or Christians who are, believe that the Holy Spirit is best portrayed by a flamingo, or just, anything like that. Those are wonderful.
That's awesome. Yeah. And then as we get to the end of the passage in verse 20, Jesus says, "And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Channeling, of course, Sirius in the movie Prisoner of Azkaban. The ones that love us never really leave us, and you can always find them in here, he says as he places his hand on Harry's chest, presumably referring to the heart, though in biblical times it would be his hand on Harry's stomach, referring to the gut, which is where the
seat of emotion was.
The seat of emotion was. Yeah. So, good job, Jesus, paraphrasing Sirius. That's how it works. Timey-wimey. Wibbly-wobbly.
Our next Sunday for this episode is the second Sunday after Pentecost, which this year falls on June 14th, also known as Proper 6 or Lectionary 11, depending on which calendar you're using. And our first reading is from Exodus chapter 19, verses 2 through 8a. The Israelites, traveling in the wilderness after escaping slavery in Egypt, arrive at Mount Sinai. God announces through Moses that they will be God's people, and God will make a covenant with them.
One of the themes in this that comes up in this passage is the game telephone. God tells Moses, and Moses tells the people, and the people tell Moses, and Moses tells God. I'm not sure how much of all of that actually got recorded accurately. It's kind of like in Goblet of Fire when Hermione is the go-between Ron and Harry when Ron is upset that Harry's one of the Triwizard Champions.
And Hermione loves that job.
Yeah. Hermione
no one likes
does it for about 5 seconds and then is like, I'm done with this. Or when Ron pretends to be the go-between between like a million different people, Hagrid being the first and Harry being the last.
Yes.
And then Harry's like, what?
I would also just like to throw in a comment here that this is not how healthy churches do communication, and please don't take this as a lesson on how churches should communicate with their people or with God. That's just not going to go good places.
Well, this is not good communication skills, and if you read further in Exodus, you'll find that, in fact, there's a golden calf thing that comes up.
Yeah, it's not going to end well for them
broken. It doesn't go well. Yeah, 40 years in the wilderness. No. In verse 4, God is reminding the Israelites through Moses about God's saving actions and talks about having borne them up on eagle's wings and brought them to God's self. And fun fact, in the Bible, the word for eagles is also the word for vultures.
In Hebrew?
In Hebrew, yeah. And so then I was thinking about that and was like, well, an eagle bringing out on eagle's wings, bringing out by vulture, which would have a certain, like, bringing out from, like, the places of death, because that's what vultures are, like, where vultures gather. But then I was like, bearing them on phoenix tail feathers would have been a heck of a lot easier because they would have been light as a feather.
Assuming that the phoenix didn't, catch on fire while they were flying. Because that could be...
Well, yeah, get one that's not, like, near burning day.
One would hope.
You gotta think that God would be, like, more on top of it than Dumbledore, and therefore, like...
More on top of it, yes. On the other hand, in favor of the occasional random moment of pure chaos... I mean, think about the Bible stories. Think about some of the things the disciples did.
Minor detail. God is literally trying to save them from slavery.
Well, yes, that's true. And did a very good job. I have to point out that I am very impressed that you did not immediately go to Lord of the Rings and riding away from Mount Doom on the backs of eagles, quite literally.
Yeah, I'm due for another Lord of the Rings marathon.
Okay. Because I'm going to say, like, I'm the one who keeps bringing up, I'm expecting Emily to bring this up, and then you don't, and then...
I know there was something else later in the episode that you bring up and I don't, and I glanced at it and was like, oh, yep, mm-hmm.
Which is totally fair, and you don't always have to, be that person. That's okay. I will step in now and then.
I'm glad that we can be a team like this.
Exactly. This is what working together is all about. But...
Bringing Lord of the Rings into Harry Potter conversations.
Our listeners should be used to this by now. That this should not be news.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, we don't actually get a scene like that in Harry Potter, which seems kind of unfair. I think we've commented earlier that would have totally been awesome. And the closest we get is the trio escaping from Gringotts while riding a dragon. And I do love that image, though, because,
That would be cool.
of course, every time I hear this verse, I bore you on eagle's wings, the thing that comes to mind is the song that is such a famous hymn in Christian circles and is such a huge favorite for funerals, especially.
And really hard for people to sing.
It depends. But can you imagine how different the song would be if the image that the author had come up with was, and I will bear you up on dragon's wings.
That would be amazing.
I mean, and lots of lovely fire imagery for the Holy Spirit, and it could be fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
also
that would
possibly
be really
perching
cool.
on top of a giant hoard of gold, but whatever.
You know. And then in verses 5 and 8 of this telephone game, God tells the people, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. And the people all answer as one, everything that the becoming one has spoken, we will do. This is along the lines of a thing called informed consent. You've got to know what you're getting into before you actually get into it, which is not the case in the magical world where they don't believe in consent/informed consent really much at all. Not to mention, at the age of 11, Harry couldn't have any idea what he was getting into. Or even, like, any 11-year-old muggle-born kid can't have any idea, like, the full ramifications of magic, but I think they could have prepared Harry a little bit better.
If there was an 11-year-old who did know what they were getting into in this case, that would be a pretty traumatized 11-year-old. Oh my goodness.
Exactly. Yeah. And, like, that's why parental people and guardians are there to protect kids, because nobody can consent at age 11. That's just not possible.
Except ice cream.
Ice cream.
It's kind of the one thing that Harry consents to in that book and is legit. Like, you know, he gets to have the leftover Knickerbocker glory that...
It's true. And the lemon ice.
Yeah.
And then he has ice cream at Florian Fortescue.
Oh, that's true.
He's just, like, all about the ice cream. Got good memories with ice cream. Maybe that should be his Patronus.
I mean, if you were getting away from the Dursleys and discovered that you were a magical person, would ice cream not be on the list of, okay, my life is now awesome, let's celebrate? I mean, it would be for me, but I'm lactose intolerant, but maybe the magical world can do something for that.
I bet there's a potion for that.
Probably.
Although, according to J.K. Rowling, it probably doesn't exist, so...
Because the magic would fix my lactose intolerance, yes. But not my eyesight, because that totally makes sense.
Yep.
Moving on.
How it works.
Speaking of verse 8, in verse 8 we also hear that the people answered Moses as one. And this is one of those verses that I tend to think of as being the less believable verses in the Bible. Or perhaps it's just one of those moments when the Bible is adorably optimistic. But since when do we answer as one to anything? Like, literally anything. Like, both in the Bible and in Harry Potter. Did they not have a Rita Skeeter/Daily Prophet looking to interview people who thought that Moses was actually a retired rock star Stubby Boardman of the Hobgoblins? I mean, you know, they've got to have several different opinions there. If they did answer as one, I'm sure it was, you know, God helping them along with that.
Yeah, even these days, not everybody loves Betty White.
Very sad.
Our next reading for this Sunday is Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. Paul explains that God's love, evidenced by Jesus' willingness to die for us, is why we have peace with God, and can therefore have hope even when we are suffering. So one of the themes in this passage is a disregard for public opinion or popularity. It's, as Paul explains, it's not about what other people think, it's about God and what God is up to. And this is really where Fudge got in trouble. Both in that he tried to sway public opinion, you know, through writing things that were not true, but also in
being really bad at it.
Well, yeah, he was terrible at it. But he was also, like, really pulled by public opinion and wanting to be popular. And it just did not go well for him at all.
Right. I just love the idea of not caring about public opinion being a theme shared by both the Bible and Harry Potter, because A, it's very true, and B, that's actually part of why I like both of them.
And C, both of them are pretty popular in a lot of places.
Or at least some version of them, yes.
Yeah. In verse 3, Paul states, "But we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance." And that verse always just kind of strikes me, but I was thinking about it and thinking about, like, the the sufferings that people experience throughout the Harry Potter books, and it's hard to think of battle scars as being a source of boasting. Like, would people actually boast in suffering or torture? I think about the people that I know who have been in wars, and they mostly don't talk about it at all, let alone boasting about it. And so then there's this, like...
The people who actually boast about their scars tend to be athletes. I've known quite a few athletes who are, let me tell you the story of how I got this one, in my experience.
I mean, I have some scars that, like, I might tell people about, like the one in the side of my head, but not, like... But that's not suffering.
Yeah, not
right. Like
stuff.
that's a funny story from growing up. Yeah, and it just was like striking me that Harry doesn't boast about the scars on the back of his hand from Umbridge's torture.
Right.
And we would be confused if he did. Like, they remind him sometimes of things.
I mean, he's traumatized, but he's not that traumatized.
Yeah. So I was just struck by that.
Yeah, I read that verse, and I think that... Okay, so, granted, my Hebrew is terrible. My Greek used to be marginally better than that. But I think that this is one of those cases where Paul loves to write very, very, very long sentences, and because of that, sometimes what he's referring to at any one given moment isn't always all that clear, and you have to sometimes go to the end of the... Because I read this passage and I think to myself, I don't think he's talking about boasting about the sufferings themselves. Like, I don't think this is about house elves talking about how they've punished themselves for their mistakes or bad thoughts, and, like, proudly telling each other how many times they've shut their ear in the door, or whatever. It's not boasting about the sufferings, it's boasting about the hope that is at the end of that passage in a verse or two, because this is the passage that suffering produces endurance, which produces whatever, which produces whatever, which produces hope.
Suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope.
Which
and
totally
hope
does not lead to the dark side.
Disappoint us.
That too, yes. So I think we're boasting about the hope while we're in our sufferings. But Paul loves really long sentences, and so I don't think that gets across unless you're, like, really playing with the whole passage. It's one of those things where, like, this is part of what irritates us so badly when people take one verse out of context, or even just one part of a verse out of context and try to make it mean what it sounds like without any of that context. But when you read it in context, you get a whole different sense. And it took me a very long time of reading this passage to get there, but I really think that what he's saying is that we can still boast about the hope that we have in God because of God's love for us, even while we are suffering, which I think makes a lot more sense.
I guess I always read it as, like, boasting in our sufferings, that there is a larger purpose to them. It is not just suffering for no reason, but it is suffering because of our faith.
Yes, sometimes. But I think we talked before about how this verse has been used in bad and scary ways, and so I'd like to try to address that.
Yeah, suffering is not a good thing in and of itself.
Right. And then in verse 6, we hear, "For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly." I think it was sometime last year that we came up with this, but we came up with the image of Harry as an adult, later after the books, reacting to some especially weird piece in the newspaper or something with, "This isn't what I died for," and then Ginny bops him over the head with the newspaper and tells him to stop being ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
Yes. But I think having died for the world, or even just having died for just the magical world, means you're allowed to have the occasional facepalm moment about it afterwards. I don't know whether or not Jesus has those. I tend to imagine Jesus does. But
I was going to say,
it's kind of harder to tell.
Based on Jesus in Mark especially, there are plenty of facepalm moments with us. We mess up lots. Perfect opportunity for facepalm. Mm-hmm.
Like, you think Captain Picard is good at the facepalm. Man, you haven't seen anything yet.
In verse 8, we read that God proves her love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And it got me thinking about Harry, and Harry died for others in the Battle of Hogwarts towards the end. But then, did Dumbledore die for Harry? Or did he just die? Right? Like, he didn't actually die for Harry because he wasn't protecting... I mean, he was protecting him in that...
He was protecting Draco from having to kill him.
The freezing spell. Yeah.
He was kind of protecting Snape by allowing Snape to maintain his cover. He was also...
Yeah, but Snape didn't want that.
Well, no.
Like, but that's the thing, right? Like, Dumbledore I think, thinks that he's doing these things for all of these people. But is he actually, does he actually need to die? Eventually he's going to die because the curse is going to, kill him.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the thought of, is he basically performing euthanasia for himself? Mm-hmm. Because he's in a lot of pain and has been for quite a while by then.
Mm-hmm. Especially with the extra added poisons.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can say that Dumbledore tried to live for other people. He did not always succeed to the ideal level, but he made an effort. But whether or not he died for other people is definitely up for debate.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, through chapter 10, verse 8, possibly also including chapter 10, verses 9 through 23. Jesus' 12 students, the disciples, are sent to their communities and people to heal and proclaim the coming of God's reign, and so become the apostles, which means ones sent out.
One of the themes for this passage is that of empowerment. So Jesus is empowering the students or disciples to go and be sent out. And I think one of my favorite examples of empowerment in Harry Potter is actually Harry's leadership in the DA.
Yes.
I really think he is called to be a teacher. I think that is such an underrated vocation and endeavor, and he would be so good at it because he is so good at it in the DA. He is empowering the students. He's teaching them, but also helping them to be their best and connecting and noticing the things going on with them, noticing how upset Neville gets because he knows the truth of what happened to Neville's parents in a way that other people don't. He's taking the time to get to know people and to really help them be their best selves. So, good job on your empowerment, Harry. Too bad you had to go and become a cop.
Well, I like to think that Harry would, know some things about power imbalances and maybe be able to bring some good thoughts to the Aurora Squad and maybe change some things for the better.
Doubtful. He got away with, whatever he wanted. He never had to,
was more talking about his history with the Dursleys. And also, being used as a child soldier by his headmaster and maybe having the thought that maybe people shouldn't have that kind of power over each other. Or when they do, it can be toxic.
Yeah, he would need a therapist for that. And thus we return to the original conundrum.
But he's still a Muggle boy,
so
we have access to therapists.
Yeah, but what therapist is going to understand this, right? It's back to the
it's trauma. He'd have to translate into Muggle, unless he can find someone who knows about the wizarding world. But really, it seems like in Harry's world, there must be way more Muggles that know about the magical world than the wizards and witches think.
Oh yeah, they just are terrified to tell anybody.
I mean, they all have, cousins and siblings and so many, random friends that accidentally find out and whatever. There's got to be this huge population of Muggles that know about the magical world. And
but none of the Muggles are willing to admit it because they don't want people to, think they're making things up and stuff. Yeah.
But, so you would think that maybe Harry can start up some kind of a network to connect people.
To get some therapy.
Yeah. One would hope. When we reach verse 36, presuming we're actually interested in, reading these Bible verses at some point, we hear, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that this is more like the crowds in Diagon Alley in the last book, rather than the crowds in Diagon Alley in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of us have experienced crowds in that kind of mood, and it generally sucks. So
in both kinds of moods.
Well, I mean, in the first book, the crowds are, happy and cheerful and wandering around doing their school shopping and having a good time. And so that's fine. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, the ones that are harassed and helpless and like sheep without a shepherd, I've been in those crowds. It's just a mess, and it always makes me want to go home faster.
It's hard, and it's scary. Yeah. I was noticing in verse 6, when Jesus sends the disciples out, he sends them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that got me thinking about the way that we are sent to our own people to do work with our own people. So I think of a lot of anti-racism work is educating white people and having white people talk to other white people about racism and white supremacy, partly because white people tend to listen more to white people.
Yeah.
But also because it's so much more emotional labor for people of color to educate white people.
Yeah.
And not that those are two separate things, but those compound each other.
Yeah.
And so then thinking about, like, sending purebloods to talk to purebloods, like, figuring out so that it's not always the Hermiones who have to confront the Malfoys, but that there could be Weasleys who confront Malfoys, and there could be Potters who confront Malfoy's Longbottoms.
And if Neville happens to be holding the sword of Gryffindor at the time, that's just completely by accident. It has nothing to do with him.
That is, like, not how you change them, but...
Okay, no, but I like the mental image of Neville having a serious conversation with Draco Malfoy while also just happening to be
casually, holding the sword of Gryffindor over his shoulder.
Yeah, just, hanging out. No big deal. Oh, I don't remember why I picked this up. Very weird.
Just kind of hanging out. Yep.
Yeah. When we reach verse 8, we hear, "You received without payment, give without payment." I think there are a few different ways that this could be translated into modern life. I would point out that this is not like saying, okay, you got into Hogwarts and you got to come to Hogwarts without having any student loans, and therefore you aren't allowed to receive a salary as an Auror, Harry. That is not what we're saying. Instead, this passage sounds more like saying, Harry, you were welcomed and embraced and celebrated by the magical world, and therefore when you decide to help them to fight against Voldemort, probably if you demanded a ransom to do it, it would be a bad idea, and also not do a lot for your image. Like, let's just point that out. Like, the books would be a very different thing if Harry said, well, yes, I could help you to defeat Voldemort, but, what's in it for me? So.
Instead, he's like, yes, I could help your image, Scrimgeour, but have you released this person who was most likely under the Imperius Curse? Oh, no? Okay, no. He does, the opposite of ransoming, of, holding them hostage for money. Yeah. In verse 14 and 15, I was reading it, and as Jesus is sending them out, he says that, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. This is important because so much of, particularly in the United States, the stories that have come up and the way that Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19 are used is to harm queer people when that's not actually what the story is about. And if you actually look at where Sodom and Gomorrah come up in the Bible, you see much more clearly that it's about hospitality and economics than it is...
Which totally has no bearing on our world today. No.
Yeah. My pastor did a great couple of sermons that we'll link to about Sodom and Gomorrah and when the shift in interpretation happened, and it was right when things were changing economically and with respect to land ownership. Mm. And so this verse is one of the really good ones at pointing to, it's literally there. Jesus is talking about, if you're not receiving hospitality, then keep going. And that's the connection with Sodom and Gomorrah, where the angels received hospitality, but only from this one family, and that was all sorts of complicated, and not from the town.
Yeah.
And so so that's, whenever things like Sodom and Gomorrah come up, it's always important for those who are preaching or teaching to address them, because if they're not addressed, then I'm sure somebody could take this verse and still twist it to be somehow about sex, even though it's very clearly not.
I'm sure people have. It seems like a lot of the Bible has been interpreted by people to be about sex, when in fact it has absolutely nothing to do with sex.
This passage reminded me of the trio's wanderings in the wilderness in Deathly Hallows and the ways that they received hospitality. It was more like they stole the hospitality than actually receiving genuine hospitality, because they couldn't let anybody know that they were there. So they stole eggs and left money, or stole from a grocery store and left money on the counter, kind of things. And then the one time that they do really receive hospitality, it's a trick from Xenophilius to keep them there longer, because the Death Eaters have taken Luna, and his only way to get her back is to catch, or help catch, or try to catch Harry Potter.
And now, a word from our sponsors, us. In honor of Holy Trinity Sunday, we are talking about relationships. One of the inherent aspects of the Trinity is the relationship between the three persons of the Trinity, who are also one God. This relationship is sometimes referred to as the dance of the Trinity. So today, we're sharing our favorite relationships in the Harry Potterverse. Now, for me, I've got to say, if I'm asking myself who has the most awesome relationship in the Harry Potterverse, my first thought right off the bat was Harry and Luna.
I love Harry and Luna.
Yes, I apparently totally stole Emily's thunder on this one.
Uh-huh.
The lovely thing about Harry and Luna is that Luna lets Harry express emotions and thoughts that others really don't encourage from him. Like, it's not that they don't let him, but it's not where they encourage him to go, usually. And he is very gentle and kind with her, and definitely very open-minded in a way that it's not like it's out of character for him, but it's not a way that he usually displays with other people very often. And I just love the few scenes that we get of them together because they show off the best parts of the other, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like their relationship and the way that it is a unique relationship compared to the other relationships that either of them have with anybody else.
Yeah, partly because of that. I mean, on the one hand, I love the fact that they remain platonic because platonic relationships between men and women in fiction tend to be rare and, frankly, usually pretty terrible. But on the other hand, it's one of the reasons why, as much as I do love Ginny, I've also always kind of liked the idea of Harry and Luna at least trying something at some point. Because they don't have to. I'm not a...
That's like when everybody ships Neville and Luna.
Well, I always felt like they shipped Neville and Luna because they were leftover characters, and not because of a relationship they had. Right. But sometimes when you have a relationship that is this unique, it encourages you to try to change the type of relationship it is. So I've always thought that was a possibility for them.
Yeah.
But I don't think it has to happen. I don't really have a one true pairing for Harry. I like him and Ginny together. They're good together, but I think there are other options.
Yeah. I don't think there needs to be a pairing for Harry, necessarily. But I love the Harry and Luna relationship, partly because it's not a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship. It is just a relationship of a different kind of love and a different kind of affection.
Yeah. I think maybe the reason why I'm interested in the idea is because the kind of gentleness they have between each other is also a aspect of my favorite romantic relationships that I've seen in the real world. Like, in terms of how couples treat each other. That kind of gentleness is almost always a characteristic of the best relationships I've seen. So
interesting. Yeah. I agree to disagree, though.
That's fine.
So, because Kay stole my idea.
I'm here to ruin your life.
Yeah, that's totally what I said. That's not at all blowing things out of proportion.
We never do that on this podcast.
No, never, ever, ever. The relationship I was thinking about was the relationship between Sirius, Remus, and Tonks. And I think a lot of this is from fandom for me. But thinking about the three of them and the many nuanced ways that they are in relationship with each other, that they share love with each other, and they are people who care deeply for each other and fight for each other and have a long-standing relationship, right? Presumably, Tonks and Sirius knew each other before because Tonks was...
semi-cousin.
Yeah, like they were family. And Sirius and Remus were, dating, and so Tonks would have known them in that capacity and then as adults, and the way that their relationship was able to grow into adulthood. And I think that's something that's rarer to have happen. But I've had a couple of relationships where, like, I have been the kid in the relationship with an adult, and then we've been able, as I grew up and went to college and went away and am now, full-blown adult-ish.
There's a terrifying thought.
I know.
Not about you, but, about us.
No, about me, too. But now, to be able to have an adult relationship with, my youth director from when I was a kid and in high school and stuff. And I think there's something really beautiful about the ability to shift relationships in that way that doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
Yay, relationships. Our final Sunday for this episode is the third Sunday after Pentecost, which falls on June 21st this year. It is also known as Proper 7 or Lectionary 12. Our first reading is Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 7 through 13. While Jeremiah has apparently become a laughingstock in the process of being God's prophet, he has not lost his faith that God will ultimately prevail. So one of the themes in this passage is isolation in suffering. Jeremiah very much talks about feeling alone and the suffering that he is experiencing because of the work that he's doing as God's prophet. And it certainly brings, as most of us in this pandemic have acknowledged, a whole new level of appreciation for Sirius's isolation in Order of the Phoenix, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But that space of being alone and feeling like you are suffering alone is a really difficult space to be in. And so for Jeremiah, it's hard for him to find, it feels like everybody is against him. And so there's not a place where he can find comfort. And Sirius has people who can provide that comfort in some respects, but also has, Snape poking every time he sees him. And even the people who are providing comfort, they can still go out and they can still go do things. It's just Sirius who can't, which in some ways just makes it harder.
Yeah.
In verse 8 of this passage, Jeremiah says, "Whenever I speak, I must cry out. I must shout violence and destruction, for the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and derision all day long." Jeremiah is just having a really rough time. But I was thinking about the reproach piece and the ways that Professor McGonagall in particular knows when is the time and place for reproach as part of a more holistic pedagogy. That part of being a good teacher is not just affirming students, but also being able to reproach students in ways that they can hear it and in ways that can help them grow.
Yeah, I've always thought that part of being a good teacher, and every pastor spends a little time being a teacher at some point, is you have to have a little McGonagall authority, I guess. Not like, vengeful or abusive authority, but just the ability to give a student a look, and then they realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing that. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's even, like, when we were talking about our favorite teachers on one of our word from our sponsors, the teacher that I had in mind was Miss Benish, and she was a McGonagall-like teacher. She had authority, she knew it, she was strict, but she was strict and she was a good teacher.
Yeah. In verse 9, we read Jeremiah say, "Within me there is something like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I am weary with holding it in, I cannot." He's talking about the fact that he has actually tried to not be God's prophet, and when he's tried to do that, he's wound up with this burning fire shut up in his bones, which is a great mental image. And he just can't hold it in anymore. And so it sounds kind of like him trying to not be God's prophet is much like Harry trying not to meddle in things for, half a chapter at one point.
In the first book, yeah.
He tries so hard, and it lasts for 30 minutes. And, oh well.
Yeah, I actually thought of that when I was thinking about that same verse. I was thinking about Harry trying to hold in the truth about Voldemort when he's trying not to get in trouble in Umbridge's classes, and he can do it for all of half of a class, right? The first class, he just kind of doesn't know because he's not paying enough attention.
Right.
But then the next class, he knows, and he still gets sent to McGonagall for detention because he can't hide the truth. He can't not tell the truth when it is such an important truth to tell.
Yeah. I think we've said before, actually, that when it comes to comparing the prophets in the Bible with Harry Potter characters, Jeremiah compares very nicely with Harry in Book 5, because that is all caps Harry, rage lock Harry.
Mm-hmm.
I think comparing Jeremiah to Harry is generally a pretty safe bet. Speaking of which, in verse 10, we hear Jeremiah say, "For I hear many whispering, terror is all around, denounce him, let us denounce him." Though presumably Jeremiah was not called the heir of Slytherin, because Slytherin wouldn't even be born for over 1,000 years yet, but we do remain unaware of whether anyone thought that Jeremiah had eyes as green as a fresh pickled toad, which Harry at the time definitely found as persecution, because he got, chased down by a Cupid and tackled, if I remember correctly.
That's true, although I think it was not intended as persecution the same way.
But persecution is not always intended that way. So
that's true. I feel like in Jeremiah's case, though, it probably was intended.
Yes. Yeah. Our next reading for this episode is from Romans chapter 6, verse 1b through 11. Paul explains that our baptism frees us, not for sinning as we like, but instead from sin's ultimate consequences.
So one of the themes for this passage is the idea of responding, particularly as instead of reacting. So I think it's easy for, our go-to thing that we do after something is a reaction usually, and it takes actual thinking and processing to respond. So part of what Paul is talking about is responding to God's grace, not reacting and saying oh, we can do anything, let's do all the terrible things, but to actually take the time to think it through and respond to God's grace by then showing grace and love to other people. And so I was thinking about it with McGonagall's offer of biscuits to Harry in Order of the Phoenix, the first time he gets sent to her office from Umbridge's class, and she's like, "Here, Harry, have some biscuits." And Harry's like, "No," and he just reacts and he's mad, and she talks to him some more and explains everything that's going on and all of that stuff. And she's like, "Really, Harry, have a biscuit." Well,
manage your blood sugar.
Really, Potter, have a biscuit. And then he takes a biscuit. But it is that his initial reaction is to just reject everything. And then it's okay, stop, breathe, think, respond. And he takes a biscuit. The response is take the biscuit. The reaction is reject it.
I am not usually one to, insert mentally scenes of characters drinking between scenes in fiction, but I have always figured that McGonagall watched him leave her office and then immediately got out a flask, because if you don't deserve one after that, then...
Yeah. Oh, that's, part of me is, how many teachers had that reaction, though, to, Harry, or especially to the Weasley twins every time they were ever in their office. I'm sure that those 7 years that the Weasley twins were in McGonagall's office probably did more damage to her liver than...
Or, was there a 15-year-long tradition of a toast at the beginning and end of every year of, "Yep, we're getting a new Weasley next year."
Well, and it would have, lined up not quite with the Marauders, but, there would have been just these precious few years where they had no Marauders and no Weasleys. Although I imagine, Bill and Charlie wouldn't have been... Well, Bill in particular. They could have gotten into some trouble, I guess.
Well, some, but they weren't quite up to the twins level. Yeah.
Yeah. It just, builds to the twins and then kind of dips a little because Harry takes over the trouble thing and Ron is the supporter. And then Ginny just gets away with it because she's smart enough to not get caught.
When you are the youngest of that many children, I have to imagine you've been taught early. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, in this passage, in verse 1, we hear the question, should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? Which made me think about the Wizengamot, and once the Wizengamot is proved to be corrupt / pointless, or even before then, when just the whole concept of justice or criminal justice in the wizarding, in the magical community is completely dysfunctional. What does stop magical folks from doing bad things? Or is it really just that they, don't get caught? Because magical law enforcement does a really bad job, especially in the Second World War. But, do they ever actually redeem it? Presumably they do, because rumor has it Hermione becomes part of the magical law enforcement department. But she originally
at least
says
becomes
she
minister,
never would.
And therefore at least has control over them in some level.
Yeah, I think it's only according to J.K. Rowling that she actually joins. So
I like to think of Hermione just like flitting from one job to the next and, cleaning up the place and sorting things out and then moving on. And
I could see her doing that.
Yeah. In verse 2, we hear, how can we who have died to sin go on living in it? And kind of related to Emily's previous point, I realize that this is not quite what this verse means, because Harry's death in the books had nothing to do with sin whatsoever, exactly. But I have this marvelous mental image now.
Except that evil and sin.
Well, I mean, yes, evil was involved, but his death wasn't about that. It was about helping people.
Mm-hmm.
His death didn't have any impact on sin and other people.
Mm-hmm.
But I have now this marvelous mental image of Harry, post-final Volda battle, just finally saying screw it and going on a presumably muggle bank robbing spree. Like, dude, I died for all you people. I am so done with this, I cannot even tell you. It sounds like wizards would have no trouble getting around Muggle bank security measures, and as trauma responses go, that would actually not be the worst option. It's not great, but as trauma responses go, you'd kind of get why he was doing that, and also, hopefully he would be smart enough to only take from people that could afford it. But now there's the sequel to the Harry Potter series that we never knew we wanted, right?
I mean, it would not be the worst option, but it also would be the least logical option, because he has plenty of money.
Well, he's a wizard. He's not supposed to have logic. Also, we don't actually know that he still has plenty of money. We know he started out with plenty of money. We don't really know how much is left.
Oh, he still has plenty based on, how much he had the last time that he actually went to Gringotts. He's got, he has, all of the Potter gold.
But I want this sequel of Harry Potter Destroys Capitalism.
Okay, but, does that actually destroy capitalism?
Depending on which banks you rob.
What's he doing with the money then? He'd have to Robin Hood it. If he were Robin Hooding it, I could, totally get on board with this.
Yes, I could.
I was going to say that he could also, go and ride all the roller coasters and just, break in at night and make the roller coasters work. And that would be fun. And breaking the law, and not, robbing people of all their savings.
Right. No, not people who actually still need the money, but people who are, just ridiculously rich. Yes.
Ridiculous.
I've read a lot of Harry Potter fanfic, and I've read a lot of stories that came up with some really interesting trauma response options, I'm moving to Florida because why not?
I read that one because you shared it with me.
And
Transfigurations.
Yes, and so, I love the thought of Harry just going off on a wild hare and doing something wonky, but I especially love the idea of, I think no one's actually, I've seen a few of Harry Potter and occasionally even the trio becoming crime bosses because they'd actually be really good at it after the series. But I've never seen a specific bank robbing spree or just acknowledging that we're not doing this because it seems like a good idea or because we might as well, but just because it's going to be more interesting and we don't really have anything quite that dramatic to do anymore. In verse 9, we hear, we know that Christ being raised from the dead will never die again. And this is another example of Harry not being Jesus. We do love to point that out every now and then. We are presuming that Harry will, in fact, die again of old age, if nothing else, although presumably at a wizarding old age rather than a muggling old age. Muggle old age? Muggling old age?
A wizarding old age?
However you want to grammar that. Presumably by the time he's that old, he will have figured it out. And being raised from the dead is not necessarily an immediate promise of immortality. For example, hi Lazarus! Whether you're talking about the Bible or fiction.
In verse 10, continuing on the, dying theme, we hear Paul say that
we are such a cheerful podcast.
The death Christ died to sin once for all, but the life Christ lives, they live to God. And that got me thinking about Lily's death was a once for, maybe not all, but once for Harry kind of thing. And it actually did last in a way that usually deaths for other people don't last. Right? You were talking about presumably Harry dies of old age, and that's true, but Harry's not going to die at the hands of Voldemort because of Lily's protection. And
right.
When
at the age of 1, anyway. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when Vernon is upset with Harry in Order of the Phoenix because Harry's spying, trying to listen to the news, and he puts his hands around Harry's neck and he's going to like throttle him. Presumably Harry's scar burns and Vernon has to like let go because his hands are like hurting him. So there's a way in which like Lily's death really was a thing that continues to be with Harry and to protect him.
And in some ways, Lily's death continues to live on as long as Harry does, and even longer, because all of the things Harry did were because her death protected him. Mm-hmm. So, like, her death lives on with his death.
Mm-hmm. And, like, the ways that when he did offer his life to Voldemort to protect people, then that is an extension of Lily's love for him, extending to the whole community that was gathered for the Battle of Hogwarts. And, yeah. She's just awesome. Yay, Lily Evans Potter.
Indeed.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 through 39. While the life that Jesus calls us to is not easy and may cause division, even among the people we love, God still loves and values us. So one of the themes that comes up in this is the connection or disconnection between value of people and hierarchies. So this passage is really, really complicated, and Jesus talks about different hierarchies, both between teacher-student and also master-slave in a time when slavery was commonplace. And though it was different from the way that the United States history of slavery has existed, it was still a thing of hierarchy and of power versus less power, oppression, those sorts of things. And the piece where Jesus inserts himself is that Jesus makes clear that someone's value is not dependent on where they are in the hierarchy. So Jesus talks about the value of people, and he's specifically focusing more on the value of like the students following what he's saying, but that your value is not in your role as master or as student or as slave or as teacher.
Right.
Lucius definitely is not on the same page with Jesus on this, right? Like his understanding is that the higher up on the hierarchy you are, the more value you have. And there's basically nothing that anybody could say to change Lucius's mind about this, but that's very much not what Jesus is talking about in this passage.
I would say Fudge also is someone who values hierarchy. Although his understanding of who's high up on the hierarchy might be rather different than Lucius's.
Yeah, I don't think it's that different, but...
Well, I think Lucius's would be mostly based on how much money do you have and how much does Voldemort value you. And Fudge would be more how much power do you have, how much influence do you have, and also probably how much money do you have would play into that.
Because money is power and influence, yeah. As we dive into the verses in this passage, verse 26, we read that Jesus says, "So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known." And within the context of this passage, part of that secrecy, not secrecy thing is that Jesus says, anything I tell you in secret, you can shout it from the rooftops. And that's an important piece. Somebody posted, I think just today, thing that was, I will give the benefit of the doubt to those who are oppressed and marginalized every time, and I will question everything about the ones in power. And it's that idea that if you are in a position of power, you should not, in any circumstance, be asking someone with less power to keep a secret. That is abuse of power, 110%. Dumbledore.
Yeah.
But if you're a person with less power like that, asking someone with more power or equal power to keep a secret, it's not the same.
And often it's about confidentiality, which is actually, that really is a different thing.
Yeah, but powerful people asking others to keep secrets is not okay. That's part of, we could go into a whole bunch of politics with certain presidential candidates, but... Or
even more recent, more personal stories. I was reminded sometime last year that it's my automatic assumption if I see a relationship break up and both people are blaming the other one, I am more likely to believe and go with the person who winds up worse off out of the relationship, like with less power and with less ability to take care of themselves. I'm more likely to believe that person than to believe the person that came out looking pretty good, because that's just part of how my brain works. But I discovered last year, when that actually happened to a friend of mine, that not everyone automatically goes with that, and that was kind of a surprise. So,
yeah, or even like the ways when people accuse others of sexual assault or sexual harassment, right?
Right.
In U.S. dominant culture, the one who's believed is always the man who is being accused.
Because he tends to be the more powerful.
Because he has more power. And the reality is that there is so much more to lose for the person doing the accusing than for the person being accused, right? Like it clearly no longer keeps you from seeking power, right? Like we have Supreme Court justices, we have presidents, we have senators, we have people across the board who have proved that you can be accused of something to like pretty convicting evidence and still
of actual criminal
continue.
Charges. Yeah. And in verses 30 and 31, we hear, "Even the hairs on your head are all counted, so do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows." And I love the juxtaposition of these two verses. The exactness of God knows even exactly how many hairs are on your head at any given moment, compared with, "You are of more value than many sparrows." Many. More than one. No, I'm not telling you exactly how many sparrows, dude. Okay, fine. 6 sparrows, okay? You're worth more than 6 sparrows. I can hear that whole conversation going on in my head every time I read this. And I love that juxtaposition of the exactness and the just completely not paying attention to exactness at all. Many, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And it reminds me of how, for example, in the magical world, potions requires exact measurements of all your ingredients, careful timing, exact stirring instructions, this many clockwise, that many counterclockwise, wait 10 minutes, drop in the thing, and then it will turn green, and at the exact moment that it hits the shade of puce, that's when you set it on fire, or whatever, But the instructions for potions are incredibly exact and specific. But somehow, for Transfiguration, all we ever see, at least, is that the magic just knows that you want to turn this button into a beetle and not, say, a bread box, because of a brief incantation and a wave of a wand. Like, how many million incantations must there be for Transfiguration, if that's going to be accurate? And yet we don't hear about any of that. Or does it just know somehow that, if you're trying to transfigure a button, it must be going into a beetle, or I don't know. There's no exactness described for how Transfiguration works compared to potions. And yet, when you think of McGonagall as a person, you imagine that must be a very careful and precise process. But we never see it. It's not something that we witness at all.
Yeah, I think part of that, though, is also, as you were saying that, I was like, but I just read somewhere, and it's because it was I'm reading Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality right now, which is a Harry Potter fanfic based on if Petunia had not married Vernon, but instead had married a professor.
Okay.
And so Harry grew up as an only child, but with like as much access to books and reading as he wants, and he becomes a Ravenclaw and stuff. And
sure.
Part of it is like there's a description of how Transfiguration works, given the like complexities of it. So.
But Rowling didn't give that to us. And yet Rowling very carefully gave us the exactness of potions many, many times.
That's true. So, but we've already proven that Rowling is
wrong in so many ways.
Super faulty. Yeah. But I will link to Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality we'll link to that on the blog. Okay. In verse 36, Jesus talks about one's foes will be members of one's own household, having described different familial relationships being at odds with each other. So Jesus brings division and is clearly not a fan of family values. I always think of this passage and some of the other passages where Jesus talks about bringing division, and I'm like, so about those family values, it's not quite what Jesus is about. And so I was thinking about it, and I was wondering, like, what if Draco had lived into not following along with his family, right? What if he had really taken that space to self-differentiate? Like, what if he had let Dumbledore go, and Dumbledore had been able to help him before the rest of the Death Eaters got there in Half-Blood Prince. What would have happened to him, and there would have been division in his family for sure, but what would it have looked like?
Right.
And then we get that example of like what it does look like when Sirius does that he sets himself against his family because there is a more important thing. There are deeper values than what his family is trying to instill in him. And it turned out mostly okay. Like certainly it didn't turn out great for Sirius because he dies, but
seriously.
But it wasn't because of the connection to his family, right? It was because of these other convictions that he had that were part of like not following his family, but the disconnection with his family doesn't automatically require his death.
Right. In verse 37, we hear this verse that has very often been twisted in really interesting ways. So I'd like to translate it into the Harry Potter world. Whoever loves their parent who is a Death Eater more than opposing Voldemort is not worthy of me. Mm-hmm. Like, when we read these verses, let's consider what putting a person in your life above your love for God actually means. Like, what does it look like? Mm-hmm. Like, for example, if your parent is a Death Eater, I get not wanting to personally face them in battle. That's reasonable. I'm okay with that. You switch spots with, with Bob, and Bob will take on your parent, and you take on Bob's parent, or whatever. I'm sure there are accommodations that can be made. But there's a difference between that and, say, choosing to enable them in doing whatever they want because they're your parent. Like, that's not going to lead to good things. So if that's what loving your parent looks like to you, then you're going to have some issues. Or another example from fiction that comes to mind for me when we're talking about this concept is a example from the TV show Elementary. There is, at one point in the storyline, I haven't actually seen the last season, to be fair, but there is at one point in the storyline a cop who shall remain nameless, because I don't actually want to spoil this if anybody's working their way through it. But there is a cop who covers up the fact that his daughter has committed murder, and pins it on someone else, because she's his daughter, and he loves her. And for him, that means that he loves her more than he loves the idea of not letting murderers just walk around in the world without facing any consequences. Like, I think you can love your daughter and also say, you know what, you murdered someone, maybe you should face some consequences for that. Yeah, I want us to be careful about how we read this verse and not say that being Christian means you automatically have to hate your parent. That's not where that goes. Mm-hmm.
It also means that, like, when we talk about family values, that's not necessarily loving God more than loving
Christian
your
family values and American pop culture family values, two entirely different things. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I really like that explanation. I think whenever I've preached on this or other stuff, there's so much deconstruction that you have to do with this meaning, because it's not that, like, we can't just say Jesus didn't mean it, because that's not true. Right. But there's nuance to what Jesus is talking about. And I think you did a great job of getting at that nuance.
Yeah, it is so applicable to our everyday lives. I have no idea at this point, but if I had $1 for every time I had I can't explain why what this person is saying is incredibly racist, because that person is my grandparent and I love them. That if I had $1 for every time I had that conversation, I would be free of my student loans by now.
Well, and that's part of what we were talking about earlier, right? With, like, white people need to talk to white people about racism.
Yes.
It's about, like, you need to, like, this is part of Jesus calling people into those difficult conversations, to have conversations about the bigger pictures of justice and love, that they're not going to be easy conversations. They might not end well. And that is what Jesus is calling us to.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Also, I think that Jesus is perfectly okay with if, after you do all that, you go and get ice cream like Harry Potter would. That's probably fine. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm very big into comfort food.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Especially right now.
Yes. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the 4th through 6th Sundays after Pentecost.
This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles, So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.